Greetings. Welcome to Making African America, a virtual symposium on immigration and the changing dynamics of Blackness. My name is Julie Greene, and I'm the director of the Center for Global Migration Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. This conference is a collaboration between the Center for Global Migration Studies and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And joining me here in welcoming you is Joanne Hippolyte, the African Diaspora Curator at the museum.
Thank you, Julie. This conference emerged after our understanding of as a result of our understanding of the importance of African diasporic immigration to the United States over the last 150 years. From the Caribbean migrations of the late 19th and early 20th century to the more sweeping African, Latin American, and Caribbean migrations since 1965, Black immigrants have exercised a profound influence on the making of contemporary African America. They confront dual forms of racial injustice as people of African descent and as immigrants whose presence in the United States is often challenged.
Today, nearly 10% of Black Americans are immigrants or the children of immigrants, and they and their children have played a distinctive role in the struggle for human rights and reshaped the experience of Blackness along the way. This conference will explore immigrants' experiences, their ongoing ties to their homes, their musical and literary forms of expression, their struggles for civil and labor rights, and their relationship with native-born African Americans.
The encounters between native-born African Americans and Black immigrants have been powerful, leading both groups to new alliances, sometimes to new tensions and struggles, and always to new understandings of their own Blackness. Over the next 3 weeks, we will explore these issues with presentations by historians, curators, scholars, filmmakers, novelists, and activists.
Now we turn to welcome comments from 3 leaders of our organizations. Kevin Young, the director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Bonnie Thornton Dill, the Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities at the University of Maryland, and Lonnie Bunch, the Secretary of the Smithsonian.
Hello, I'm Kevin Young, the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. I'm honored to welcome you to this groundbreaking gathering on the impact of immigration on Black American identity, co-sponsored with the Center for Global Migration Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. This symposium, Making African America, Immigration and the Changing Dynamics of Blackness, will explore how demographic changes have transformed the social, cultural, and political significance of Blackness in the United States. Having personally just completed editing an anthology of African American poetry spanning 250 years of struggle and song, I'm well aware of the ways that African American identity was shaped by immigrants to this country. The Harlem Renaissance, for instance, would not be possible without immigrant energies and authors, not to mention any number of its artists becoming expatriates for a time. This gathering not only explores immigration and its impact on changing notions of Black identity in the United States, but celebrates the collaboration between UMD and the museum that has produced this innovative event. I want to first off thank the teams that helped organize this groundbreaking event and the 50 participants, scholars, journalists, activists, museum professionals, poets, and novelists who have taken time from their work to share their insights. And thank you, our audience who have joined us for this welcome and keynote address and are able to register for any of the 11 subsequent sessions of the symposium. I'd like also to acknowledge the National Endowment for the Humanities, American Express, and the William R. Keenan Jr. Charitable Trust for their support. I'd like to end by recognizing the importance of immigration as a force impacting Black life in America, and remind you that at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, we present Black American identity as multicultural and immigration as an important part of the Black American story. Thank you.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the University of Maryland, and particularly the Center for Global Migration Studies in the College of Arts and Humanities. I'm pleased to join my colleagues, Kevin Young, the new director of the Smithsonian's National Museum for African American History and Culture, and Smithsonian Secretary Lonnie Bunch, in welcoming you to the Making African America Symposium. This conference has been an aspirational vision for some time. I recall with fondness earlier conversations with Julie Greene and our friend and colleague, the late Professor Emeritus Ira Berlin, as they described the conference they were planning in partnership with the museum. So it's exciting and timely to see it come to fruition. Timely because in the midst of this 21st century racial reckoning, it is important that we both reveal and understand the complexities and variations within the African American community, at the same time that we call the nation to account for its anti-Black policies and practices. This is no small or insignificant feat. I can recall 20th century conversations in which immigration and African American history and culture, particularly in popular discourse, were characterized as oppositional. Immigrants were said to have come by choice. African Americans were brought here against their will. Comparing the two was frowned upon, and descriptions of the nation as a nation of immigrants largely overlooked the migrations, both forced and selective, of people from the African diaspora. Therefore, placing these two bodies of scholarship and thought, immigration studies and African American history and culture, in conversation will better help us all understand the African American story and who constitutes the group of people we call African American. Our differences, similarities, tensions, and conflicts, both in relationship to our places of origin, recent and distant, but also in relationship to the communities we're creating. In the College of Arts and Humanities, our aim is to produce students who are global visionaries and creative problem solvers. This conference reflects those values at the same time that it applies and enhances them. On the Maryland campus, a growing number of our Black students are the children of African and Caribbean immigrants. We therefore live the reality of a new understanding of what it means to be African American or Black American on a daily basis. That's another reason why I'm particularly appreciative of this gathering of researchers, scholars, journalists, and others. I expect that your time together will provide even greater insight into these global pathways and transitions, and that it will lead to the production of knowledge, yielding creative, collaborative approaches to this discourse. So I thank each of you for your presence and for contributing your scholarship and thought to this timely and important interdisciplinary conversation.
Hello, and welcome to the Making African America Symposium. I'm Lonnie Bunch, the Secretary of the Smithsonian, and on behalf of the entire institution, let me say how excited we are to have you join us. The National Museum of African American History and Culture is thrilled to collaborate with the University of Maryland on this symposium. I want to start by recognizing my friend, the late Ira Berlin, whose influence shapes everything we do here. Ira was a distinguished university professor of history, and he was a founding co-director of the Center for Global Migration Studies at the University of Maryland. He was a prolific and transformational interpreter of African American history. Through decades of scholarship, teaching, and publication, Ira changed the way we understand the institution of slavery and expanded our notions about race beyond black and white. In essence, we have all been students of Ira Berlin, and we have all been made better by his scholarship and his vision. And as much as he shaped this professional field that I love, Ira left an indelible impression on me personally. He was one of the first people to reach out when I was announced as director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He immediately offered to help in any way he could. His work informed so many aspects of this museum. He pushed us to incorporate cutting-edge research and engage audiences in difficult conversations. And he helped position the museum as a hub of scholarship and engagement. And his leadership was instrumental in developing and organizing the Future of the African American Past Symposia in 2016. I must admit, one of the great joys of living in Washington was going to dinner with Ira, sharing our ideas and challenges, and testing out some new foods. I dearly miss those evenings with Ira and Martha. Bursts of laughter and thoughtful exchange, the pleasures of deep friendship. But although I mourn him, I'm comforted knowing that his spirit and influence will be felt by all joining us in the Making African America Symposium. Candidly, the events of the past year have brought the Black experience to the center of American discourse in ways that I hadn't seen before. And the question of what it means to be African American is as alive and urgent today as it's ever been in this country. In the past 30 years, more Africans have come to the United States than during the entire slave trade. So we need to be asking harder questions about what it means to be African American. Though slavery continues to shape the experience of Blackness in America, continues to inform the American spirit, we cannot define the African American community as one that is exclusively descendant from enslaved. Black identity is not monolithic. It branches and builds, brings together different backgrounds, experiences, and hopes. It grows more vibrant and nuanced with every new voice. Studying immigration helps us understand the challenges and opportunities that these changes bring. Community identity, complex notions of home and belonging, the geography and demography of civil rights. Studying immigration also helps us explore the underlying tensions within Black communities, bringing to the fore radically different perspectives on identity, history, and culture. I've seen these frictions play out in my own neighborhood. We're home to a popular Ethiopian church that serves DC's growing Ethiopian community, and many of the older African American families get upset about who are these newcomers coming in, taking our parking spaces. Now, this might seem like a minor example, but it's indicative of a larger challenge, the challenge of opening up space within the African American identity to support dynamic and changing demographics, to include differences across background, across language, across experience. And what do the shifting dynamics of Black identity mean to our communities and our country going forward? How do we need to reframe our understanding of Blackness to include the effects of migration? With the exception of indigenous people who populated this land before our ancestors' arrival, we are a nation of immigrants. Black immigrants from the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa have profoundly influenced the making of African America. And just as the history of immigration is the history of the African American, so too will be the changing demographics of this decade, and it will help to determine our future. That's why a symposium like this one is so important. It brings together creative scholars across many fields, backgrounds, and interests who want to understand how the African American identity has changed. They want to explore all the diversity and richness and dynamism within this community. The participants of this symposium will delve into vitally important questions around social, cultural, and political transformation. I am happy to say that any answers we come up with will in some ways be incomplete because Blackness will continue to grow, transform, and evolve. Our exploration today necessarily looks different from conversations we'll have in future years, in future decades. I expect that our children and our grandchildren will inhabit questions and continue to explore what it means to be African Americans in ways we can't anticipate right now. In this way, the Making of African America Symposium is part of an ongoing dialogue that stretches across generations. And just as our discussions in this moment grow out of a past decades of research, of scholarship and debate, it is my hope that this symposium will help set the groundwork for future generations to understand themselves and their communities more fully. Let me thank all those whose works and support have made this event possible. Teams at the African American Museum at the University of Maryland, our partners at American Express, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the William F. Keenan Jr. Charitable Trust, to all the participants of this symposium, to all who have supported it, to all who are building on the work of Ira Berlin, thank you. And I look forward to hearing your wisdom, your scholarship, and your understanding of who we once were and who we can become. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of Making Africa America.
Thank you so much to Kevin Young, Bonnie Thornton Dill, and Lonnie Bunch for those stirring comments. I know that the initial idea for this entire project came out of conversations between Lonnie Bunch and Ira Berlin, and so we very much feel Ira's spirit with us throughout our work on this. So thank you very much. I am thrilled now to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Carole Boyce Davies, who will launch our symposium with an address titled Dislocations, Dispossessions on Borders, Walls, and Nations. Professor Davies' work has long been an inspiration to me, and so I'm really excited that she's kicking things off for us today. Carole Boyce Davies is the Frank H.T. Rhodes Professor of Humane Letters in the College of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Africana Studies and English at Cornell University. She has held distinguished professorships at a number of institutions, including the Herskovits Professor of African Studies and Professor of Comparative Literary Studies and African American Studies at Northwestern University. She's the author of Black Women, Writing and Identity, Migrations of the Subject, and also Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones. In addition to numerous scholarly articles, Boyce Davies has also published several critical anthologies. Nambika, Studies of Women in African Literature, Out of the Kumla, Caribbean Women and Literature, a 2-volume collection of critical and creative writing entitled Moving Beyond Boundaries, International Dimensions of Black Women's Writing, and Black Women's Diasporas, Volumes 1 and 2. She is co-editor with Ali Mazrui and Isidore Okpewo of the African Diaspora, African Origins and New World Identities, and Decolonizing the Academy, African Diaspora Studies. She's general editor of the 3-volume The Encyclopedia of the African Diaspora and of Claudia Jones, Beyond Containment, Autobiography, Essays, and Poetry. Her most recent monograph is Caribbean Spaces, Escape Routes from Twilight Zones, Illinois, 2013, and a children's book titled Walking. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Davies.
Hi, everybody. I am so pleased to be here, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Julie. It's a pleasure doing anything that advances the work we do, and in particular working with the National Museum of African American History and Culture and my colleagues at the University of Maryland. I feel really at home, and I'm honored to have been asked to do this. So thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to be the keynote speaker for this conference, Making African America on Immigration and the Changing Dynamics of Blackness, organized in collaboration between the Center for Global American History and Culture and the National Museum. It is quite an honor, and one wonders if it is longevity or that maybe I have had some things to say that people find useful. Hopefully the latter, as in one of the promotional events for this event, it is noted that we are starting off with me talking about diaspora. So I guess that's where I enter, right? Perhaps a bit of self-protective disclosure is warranted, as when this invitation was offered about 2 years ago, the expectation was an in-person encounter with flights already made and all of that. Even the suggested title was operating in a context in which I was writing about discussions of walls and borders. And they were therefore prominent in my head, therefore that title that you see indicated there. But basically, at that time, the question of walls and borders were really nationally presented representations of how the United States was positioning itself during the last presidency. In the postponements, though, following the pandemic and in the new format in which we are now working via a virtual keynote and the model which the symposium uses, the lessons from using Zoom via teaching is that we always wary of Zoom fatigue on both sides, the listener and the speaker. So I will keep it short. To our discussion, though, a few orienting questions are validly indicated as guiding principles, as it were. One, how does one represent a US-based domestic identification as African American while simultaneously accounting for global African American communities, especially since the majority of Africans were taken, actually, to Central and South America, producing there also large African American communities, and especially since the US African Americans also exist as well in that larger African diaspora. Two, how do those entering the US space represent and acknowledge the fact that US African Americans in each generation have to consistently claim a certain primary belonging, which continuously gets eroded, advanced more than, sometimes more than others, but consistently in a process of claiming that belonging? How do US African Americans, who are descendants of those enslaved in the US at the first level, avoid the ugliness of nativism that one sees graphically represented in white supremacist discourses, recognizing also the movements already embedded in some of these migrations during and immediately after enslavement in the Americas, suggesting that people did not just come and stay in one place, but there was constant movement all along. And then finally, how have some of our thinkers engaged these issues of Black